Hello again from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. I continue this series of videos about the Columbine High School massacre that happened near Littleton in the Denver metropolitan area of Colorado in Western United States on April the 20th, 1999. So why am I doing this video series? Well, as a longtime student of history who by God's grace has been allowed to teach history for some years, I'm interested in these kinds of events, for example, and especially anniversaries. And of course, I want to educate those YouTube viewers who are interested in finding out what really happened on that day and what difference have those events made in various people's lives. And then, of course, some of the debates concerning the details of what actually happened during that high school massacre, one of the worst ones in the US history. So this is one of the several interviews of Sue Klebold, Dylan Klebold's mother, who in 2016 published an autobiographical book called A Mother's Reckoning, which of course was also a biography of her son, but in which she also detailed how her life moved on. Eventually, and I'm very sad to report this, she and her husband, Tom, divorced. In one of the interviews of her that I have watched on YouTube, she said that one of the reasons, if I remember correctly, was the publicity. The publicity that this case generated, because Tom Klebold, according to his now former wife, Sue, is a very private person who wants to keep to himself, or at least doesn't like publicity, while she is a clearly more social and outgoing person. So as always, no copyright infringement intended, and you can of course check the originals. I'm just summarizing this information and then commenting on it. Okay. So Sue Klebold's son and his friend, meaning Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris, killed 13 people at Columbine High School, of course, before committing suicide. Nearly 2 decades on, she is still haunted by one question: is there anything she could have done? And then a link that one can click, read an extract from Sue Klebold's book, A Mother's Reckoning, and posted by Emma Brockes, or Brox, published on February the 14th, 2016. And then photograph Benjamin Rasmussen for The Guardian. Okay. The Guardian is a British newspaper, so I assume I should switch my speech to at least a quasi-British accent. One of the first things Sue Klebold does when we meet her, or when we meet, is apologize for her lack of hospitality. We are at a hotel in Denver rather than her home, not for a want of congeniality on the 66-year-old's part. So today, Sue Klebold is either 69 or 70 years old, because we are living in April 2019. But because once you have been the target of large-scale hatred, it is never a good idea to let on where you live. For the last 17 years, she has been a woman forever on the cusp of a dreadful public encounter. I can be in a doctor's waiting room and still hope they call me by my first name rather than shout out Mrs. Klebold, she says. Every time I meet someone and give my name, there's a moment of hesitancy where I watch their face very closely. Then they may say, "Why does that sound so familiar?" Gun control has become a central issue, and school security measures, lockdown drills, and metal detectors at the doors rolled out as standard, partly in response to what Klebold's son did. What hasn't changed, perhaps, is the assumption made in the aftermath of a shooting that the fault must lie predominantly with the parents, or rather with the mother. The mother is supposed to know, Klebold says. Dylan had killed children in cold blood, life after the Columbine massacre. That she claimed not to have known any of it, that the teenager under her roof was profoundly depressed, that he had illegally bought a gun and hidden it in her house, that with his friend Eric he was planning a massacre, triggered hostility at the time, and even now provokes disbelief. Klebold understands this instinct. The gentlest portrayal of us as parents in the media was that we were useless, she writes in A Mother's Reckoning, her new memoir. In other accounts, we had knowingly shielded a hateful racist, turning a blind eye to the arsenal he was assembling under our roof, thereby exposing an entire community to danger. A Mother's Reckoning is a tough read. It retraces Klebold's mental processes of the last 17 years as she revisits every parenting decision she and her ex-husband Tom ever made, raking through memories in search of evidence they missed. It also examines the horrific decades-long influence of the Columbine shooting on other violent young men and tells from the inside the story of what happens to parents when their children kill others. Briefly, divorce, bankruptcy, illness, breakdown, followed by the more complex processes and rationalizations that allow Klebold to carry on living. The most controversial element of the memoir, however, is what it asks readers to do with their notions of Dylan. At the time of the shooting, Sue Klebold, who, by the way, was assisting disabled students and had worked as a teacher and has a degree in education. So she's definitely not an ignorant or uneducated person, let alone a bad parent. Worked in the same building as a parole office and often felt alienated and frightened getting in the elevator with ex-convicts. After Columbine, she writes, I felt that they were just like my son, that they were just people who for some reason had made an awful choice and were thrown into a terrible, despairing situation. Of course, Klebold feels compassion in part because she's asking for compassion. More than that, she's asking for forgiveness. But she's also asking that a fundamental reassessment take place of what it is that can make teenagers kill. After almost 20 years spent thinking about it and having immersed herself in the worlds of suicide and murder-suicide prevention, because of course it was also a murder-suicide because those two boys ended up killing themselves as well. What Klebold concludes is, in its way, more shocking than the idea that she was a bad parent or that Dylan was evil. She would, she writes, give her life to recover just one of the lives that was lost at the hands of her son, but she won't subscribe to the theory that he was a monster. He was a human being, she tells me, turning to look out of the window. It shouldn't come as a surprise, but it does. She still loves him. Well, there is that special kind of love called maternal love that most women who have or have had children feel. Of course, there are some mothers who are so hardened on the inside that they no longer feel any maternal love, but most women feel at least a bit or somewhat of it. Based on his mother's account, the impression one gets of the young Dylan Klebold is of a straightforwardly wonderful child. Nonetheless, when Klebold writes that our younger son was observant, curious, and thoughtful, with a gentle personality, there is nothing to suggest she's being untruthful. She called him her sunshine boy on account of his blonde hair and sunny nature, and our little trooper because of his determination to see projects through. Of her two boys, Dylan was the one she thought she didn't have to worry about. In the aftermath of the shooting, she effectively lost him twice, first physically, then as a memory. How does one mourn a child one considered a decent and loving son when his photo appears on the cover of Time magazine under the headline "The Monsters Next Door." I wanted people to understand that he was loved and cuddled and held and touched. And I had all kinds of pictures of Dylan on laps and with arms around him. There was, she says, an assumption that he was mistreated or not loved, one that Klebold knew not to be true. Over and over, she asked herself, did we hug him enough? Other misconceptions were easier to dispel. One of the stories that took hold about the Klebolds after the shooting was that they were rich, and that Dylan's violent behavior was an extreme version of a spoiled child's petulance. Aerial photos of the family house in Littleton, Colorado, make it look huge when in fact Klebold says they bought it for a song as a fixer-upper. Likewise, Dylan's BMW, which cost his parents $500, and which he and his father remodeled from scratch. They were that kind of family, eating around the table every night, watching old movies together, collaborating on projects. Whenever Byron, the eldest son, came over for dinner, Klebold would send him back to his apartment with a freezer bag full of food. This would sound gilded, except here is Klebold, revisiting every detail in a way that implies it might have been easier on her psychologically if there had been a catastrophe in the household, something pointing to why Dylan did what he did. Instead, in the years before the shooting, there were only very ordinary domestic tensions. Tom Klebold, a geophysicist, was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, damaging his job prospects and causing the couple to worry about money. Well, because the United States is the only advanced economically advanced Western country to still lack a national or federal health insurance. Even the so-called Obamacare still leaves over 10 million people, maybe up to 15 million or more, because of population growth, with only the so-called catastrophic health insurance. In other words, if their physical lives are in an imminent danger of being lost because of a sudden illness like a heart attack, a stroke, an insulin shock, or something similar, because of an accident, or because of a homicide attempt, then they are rushed to the nearest medical facility, whether that be a health center or a trauma center or hospital, and everything is done which is humanly possible to save their lives. However, should they survive that acute risk to their physical lives ending, then either they or their loved ones or their friends or perhaps their employers have to foot the bill. And I'm sorry that this gets off track. It is quite curious that Donald Trump claims to defend the ordinary Americans, and yet he wants to reform healthcare in a way that, at least on the short run, would deprive millions, if not some tens of millions, of Americans of any health insurance except for that catastrophic one, because they simply would not be able to pay the high and often rising premiums. Sue's job coordinating grants to help disabled people learn computer skills was satisfying but not terribly well paid. Then there was Byron. Before the late 1990s, the biggest upset to have shaken the Klebold family was when a small amount of marijuana was found in Byron's room. Byron, still at school at the time, was made to attend counseling sessions, and his parents intervened to end friendships they believed weren't in his best interests. The fact that a few years later they would fail to sever their younger son's friendship with Eric Harris when the two got into similar trouble was, Klebold says, testament to Harris's charm and their faith in Dylan's good sense. It was also evidence of the fact that up to that point, the most Dylan had ever given them to worry about was being a little on the shy side, except for a threat, and this comes from another interview, I think the interview that she gave to Psychology Today, apparently a psychological magazine published in the United States, that he had made a threat to the boyfriend of a girl whom he had been romantically interested in. And as a result, he had been suspended for some days from the school. And in that interview, Mrs. Klebold called it such a silly boy thing, and it was. However, it could have been an early warning sign that Dylan was actually thinking about not just threatening, but even hurting and killing other people, as his good friend Eric Harris was as well. After the shooting, he would be characterized as a dysfunctional loner with a single psychopathic friend, Harris. But Susan Klebold denies that assumption, assuring the interviewer that her son had a small, close circle of friends, of whom Eric was just one. In the memoir, she only says of the Harrises that the father was ex-military, in other words, an ex-army officer or ex-soldier, and that they liked the Harrises, although they didn't see them socially. Of Eric, she wrote, he was always respectful and perfectly polite, which of course proves how masterful deceiver Eric was. He had this murderous occultist slash Satanist double life, which he hid so skillfully. The strain around these remarks is palpable. After the shooting, Klebold's first impulse was to blame Harris. He must have brainwashed Dylan, she thought, or coerced him in some other way. I suggest that she makes a moral distinction between the two boys. I don't know if moral is the right word, she says. They had different brain conditions. I believe Dylan had some kind of a mood disorder. I believe psychopathy is in a different category. For whatever reason, the two were like magnetic poles. They stuck together. They fed each other. She says, I don't want to say someone commits crimes because they have a mental illness. That is not true, but I believe strongly that both Dylan and Eric were victims of their own pathology, just as everyone else was a victim of that pathology. I tell her that reading her book, one is inclined to think, oh, well, if it wasn't the Klebolds who caused this, then it must have been the Harrises. And that is exactly what people do when there's a crime like this. The changes were tiny and almost indistinguishable from the normal fluctuations of adolescence, but Klebold now believes that if she had known then what she knows now, she might have been able to spot them. Dylan did show outward signals of depression, she writes, signs Tom and I observed, but were not able to decode. If we had known enough to understand what those signs meant, I believe that we would have been able to prevent Columbine. Dylan's sleep patterns changed. He went from being an early riser to a late one. He was short-tempered and withdrawn, and his hair went ungroomed. He wrote an English essay that contained violent imagery, which should have flagged him immediately, she says, but no one was looking out for these things back then. For the first time in his life, he got into trouble at school, vandalizing some lockers with Eric. Finally, a year before the shooting, or actually somewhat over a year, either in January or February 1998, interestingly enough, around the time when Eric on his website wrote something like this: I don't care if I die. All I want to do is to kill as many of you, and then a profanity, especially a few people like Brooks Brown. Brooks, incidentally, was one of their schoolmates. They had an on-again, off-again friendship. And Brooks Brown's parents actually reported that threat to one of the local police stations. Unfortunately, although an affidavit was written, it wasn't forwarded. Because had it been forwarded, then Eric Harris might have even been charged with unlawfully, illegally threatening to kill a specific person. And he might have been given extensive psychotherapy and a suspended sentence, meaning that if he, during his probationary period, got into any further trouble legally, he would have to go to jail. Even such criminally, or with regard to the criminal justice system, liberal countries, as my distant native land, Finland, in Northern Europe, start the age of criminal responsibility and the minimum age of incarceration or imprisonment at 15. Interestingly enough, my current homeland, the Philippines, only allows the incarceration of juvenile delinquents at the age of 18, which in my opinion is too high. I think it should be brought down to 15. Well, in the United States, depending on the particular jurisdiction, according to what I have heard already in the mass media, even 6-year-old children can in some cases be imprisoned. Obviously not as harshly as adolescents, let alone adults, but still imprisoned. Of course, they must be given some kind of distance learning schooling, resembling homeschooling or prison schooling, of course. But still, I think that's cruel. But 15-year-old teenagers are old enough, in my opinion, if necessary, to serve a prison sentence. Of course, they should not be given as long prison sentences as adult offenders, but they should still be given, in case that is needed, more than just a short symbolic sentence, especially if they have some previous record of trouble with the law and they show no remorse for what they have done, or not a sufficient remorse according to the judge and or the jurors. The boys stole some electrical equipment from an unattended van and were arrested. The Klebolds were appalled, but also relieved that, because it was a first offense and the boys came from good homes, in quotation marks, they were let off with some counseling and community service. She now wishes they had been given a custodial sentence. If they had, Columbine almost certainly wouldn't have happened. At the time, although worried, she told herself, Dylan's growing up, he's testing his boundaries, he's doing things he's never done before. They are terrible choices, but good, he's learned his lesson. Well, that was the impression that he falsely gave. And even more masterfully, Eric Harris gave. They pretended to be truly sorry for what they had done. And their counseling officers or diversion officers then wrote good reviews about them. Eric was an intelligent youngster who was likely to succeed in life. And then Dylan was also bright, but needed to understand that success meant good effort or something like that. These are not exact quotes. I was never for a moment thinking that he was a danger to himself or to anyone else. Dylan's mandatory counseling sessions went well, at least outwardly. He applied to and won a place at the University of Arizona. 3 days before the shooting, he attended his high school prom with a girl, Robin Anderson, who unwittingly had bought 1 or 2 guns for him. Dylan was still legally a minor, 17 years old. Excuse me. There was one odd incident. This was a year before the massacre and one of the very rare moments in the book when one questions Klebold's handling of her son. Dylan was rude to her, as he had been a lot that spring, meaning spring 1998, and when she lost her temper, challenging him on his bad attitude and pushing him against the fridge door He said, "Stop pushing me, Mom. I'm getting angry and I don't know how well I can control it." The voice he used was soft and carried warning power, Klebold says, and she immediately backed off. Later, she apologized to him. I remarked to her that it was a chilling exchange, and Klebold agreed it was. It was also clearly a threat. Klebold says she was never frightened of Dylan, but there is a sense around that time that she was walking on eggshells. Wasn't she inclined to say, "How dare you threaten me?" I never thought of saying that, she says. It isn't in character for me to say something like, "How dare you threaten me?" I listened to what he said. He asked me to stop. I stopped. And then we circled back and we both apologized. I now have a strong sense that I should have responded by saying, "I don't understand. This isn't like you." She says, "I could see his behaviors were changing. I attributed it to being an adolescent, and it is my deep regret that those behaviors might have indicated something else, depression perhaps. That is why I say to people, if your children misbehave, if a young man is irritable, if your daughter has a lot of somatic complaints, this could be a mental issue." We have to be able to ask questions such as, "Do you wish you could just die sometimes? Have you ever thought about suicide?" I think we have to do a better job of listening and not trying to fix our children's lives. I never had anger towards him except for the moment when I saw the basement tapes at the sheriff's department. In other words, those videotapes that they had filmed partly at the Harris's home in the basement or underground floor, and then one was filmed, ironically enough and now tragically enough, at the Klebold's home. And in one tape, Eric was driving a car. Because I summarized those tapes transcripts, they can still be found online through Google. Now, 6 months after he died, that is in October, in or around October 1999. These were the home videos made by Dylan and Eric before the shooting, in which they cavorted around, viciously slamming everyone they knew, throwing out racist epithets and talking about the killings they intended to do. I felt about a day of anger because he was bad-mouthing everybody and everything, family members, and pulling things out of his past. Some incident in daycare when he was 3 years old. But I just couldn't sustain that anger. I feel that Dylan was a victim of some kind of malfunction going on in his brain. The Dylan I knew and raised was a kind person. He was thoughtful. He was conscience-ridden, which is why this is still so difficult for me to understand. I feel a need to apologize to anyone who might be offended because I'm not angry at him or don't judge him, but I don't because he is my son and because I believe that whatever killed all the others killed him too. When Dylan Klebold left the house that morning, it was still dark, by the way. According to one of the articles I've copied to my laptop, around 5:30 a.m. on the morning of that fateful day, April the 20th, 1999. He yelled goodbye in a tone that gave his mother pause. It had a flat, nasty ring to it, she says, which she has since analyzed like a Rubik's Cube. I have turned it every which way. Was he saying to me, "You were a bad mother"? So he had left the house early, at least apparently. This is my interpretation and assumption, to attend a bowling lesson. The school permitted students to take bowling as an elective physical education module, hence the title of the Michael Moore documentary about Columbine, Bowling for Columbine, which was at least released in or around 2002, so about 3 years after the shootings, in which he also demanded effective gun control in the United States. But Dylan never showed up. Instead, he met Eric Harris, and the two of them made their way to the school carrying guns and explosives after having videotaped themselves one last time. And that is not the Italian-American pop star Ariana Grande's famous song, but One Last Time in this life. Dylan's mother will never know why he did it. All she can say is that a certain percentage of people who die by suicide take the lives of others at the time of their death. In fact, according to the US Department of Health, murder-suicide represents a tiny fraction of the overall suicide rate, around 3%. But suicide is the second leading cause of death among 15 to 24-year-olds. In other words, mid to old teenagers and young adults. And it is, Klebold believes, a juxtaposition of biological factors, psychological factors, social and environmental factors, and trigger events. She was at work when her husband rang, in other words, phoned. This is one of the notorious differences, if you may call it that, or funny ones between British English and North American English, for example, or increasingly international English, which is clearly more North American than British. Telling her there had been an incident at the school and yelling at her to turn on the TV. Her first thought was, Dylan is in danger. By the time she got home, the gunmen were both dead and had been identified as wearing black trench coats of a kind the Klebolds knew Dylan and Eric owned. Tom rang their lawyer, who rang the sheriff's office, who told them that Dylan wasn't a victim but one of the perpetrators. And so the spiral began. The Klebold's lawyer told them to expect a firestorm of hatred. They fled their house. Tom told his wife he wished Dylan had killed them too. Sue wished she could die quietly in the night. In the days that followed, they considered changing their name and moving towns. Distant cousins of Tom's received death threats. When sympathetic well-wishers sent around food for the couple, their lawyer made them throw it out in case it was poisoned. While the couple were still in hiding, their neighbors hung a banner outside their house that read, Sue and Tom, we love you, we are here for you, call us. Call us, spelled in capital letters. In the end, Klebold says, I felt, well, if I move away, I'm just going to be the mother of that killer. So I stayed where I had the support of people who knew us. She received vast mountains of letters. This was in the days when email had not yet become such a common form of communication as it is now. Some supportive, some hate mail, some, most disturbingly, mail praising Dylan and what he had done. The week before we met, so sometime in February 2016, two girls in Denver were arrested for allegedly planning a copycat shooting. References to Columbine were found in materials owned by that mentally troubled Korean-American student Soong Hui Cho, the 2007 Virginia Tech shooter, and Adam Lanza, the perpetrator of the Sandy Hook Elementary School massacre in 2012. In 2014, an investigation by ABC News found that at least 17 attacks and a further 36 alleged plots or serious threats against schools involved references to Columbine. So I'll make a brief international comparison. Finland, my distant native land in Northern Europe, tucked between Russia in the east, Sweden in the west, Norway in the north, and Estonia in the south. Generally speaking, has fairly quiet and safe schools as far as serious violent incidents are concerned. Homicides at schools or on the school grounds or near them are generally speaking very rare in Finland. However, in the space of just 10.5 months between early November 2007 and late September 2008. A total of 19 people, not including the suicidal killers, were killed in two separate incidents. The first one happened at an upper secondary school in the greater Helsinki region of southern Finland. An 18-year-old student who was supposed to graduate from that upper secondary school in May 2008 in cold blood murdered 7 fellow students, the school principal or headmistress, and the school nurse. While in that other incident in a small city of Western Finland, a hospitality student, so apparently studying either hotel management or restaurant management or perhaps both, murdered on a campus of a polytechnic college in cold blood on an exam day. 9 fellow students and 1 teacher who was presiding over an exam before fatally wounding himself, just like that 18-year-old had done 10 and a half months earlier. And but since then, if I remember correctly, only 1 student has died in a school violence incident in Finland. In the far north of Finland, in northwestern Finnish Lapland, at the Sami People's Upper Secondary School, a student stabbed another one to death. In the northern Finnish city of Oulu, at a vocational school, if I remember correctly, a student non-fatally stabbed some or several other students, maybe in 2015 or 16, I forget the year. In 2012, in a Western Finnish city, small city, a student who had been maybe expelled from the school or who had broken up with his girlfriend who was attending a lower secondary school tried to shoot and kill students, but a quick action by a teacher spared those students and possibly herself or himself from death. He or she managed to lock the classroom's door, and that murderous young adult man was unable to shoot the lock so badly that it would have broken and he would have been able to enter the classroom. And then in March 2009, as I recall, there was a security information session for the teaching faculty members of that upper secondary school, whose teacher I was still back then, and the lower secondary school, which was located in the same building at the time. And the topic was how to deal with the school threats. And in less than 1.5 years, accounting from the murderous shooting incident at the Jokela Upper Secondary School in Tuusula, a town in the greater Helsinki region, almost 300 threats, school threats, have been recorded by or reported to the Finnish police. According to the Finnish police investigation, only 9 out of the nearly 300 were seriously taken. So in other words, a great majority were caused by either this youthful, immature desire to get publicity, or nowadays, of course, many people, all the way from toddlers to old people, want to get publicity through YouTube, for example, or Facebook. Or then this non-murderous anger, which people just wanted to vent, or then some perverted sense of humor, or something similar. So let's go where I left off. That is why I say to people, if your children misbehave, if a young man is irritable, if your daughter... Okay, yes, I already read that. Let's see, yes. So Klebold puts these incidents down, both the actual shooting incidents and then threats, which can also cause the threateners to be arrested, down to the fact that the shooting roughly coincided with the boom in 24-hour news and was among the first to be subjected to obsessive rolling coverage. Rolling coverage means that it's covered live, not in a recorded way. She also thinks there's almost something symbolic in the town, Littleton. It's like an everyman thing. It was the shot heard round the world. But the thing we have to remember, because there were so many copycats who refer back to Columbine, is that Dylan and Eric were copycatting. They were copycatting a movie. They referred to the incident as NBK, natural born killers. And they were referring to the Oklahoma City bombing perpetrated by an anti-government far-right man, Timothy McVeigh, in April 1995, almost to the day 4 years after this shooting incident. In Oliver Stone's movie, the two protagonists cause a media sensation by going on multiple shooting sprees. She says, I know many school districts that don't want any suicide prevention training in their schools because they are so afraid of risks and lawsuits. Other aspects of the fallout were more predictable. As Klebold and her husband differed in their ways of dealing with the trauma, broadly speaking, she looked outwards, he retreated in. Their marriage of 43 years collapsed. They ran up large legal bills. Civil lawsuits brought by the families of the victims dragged on for years and were eventually settled. Between them, the Harrises and the Klebolds contributed more than $1.5 million. And remember, we are not taking into account the inflation that has happened since then, although that would not increase its value in inflated dollars by so much, because neither the first decade of this century nor this almost ended second decade of the 21st century have been inflationary ones, contrary to the 1970s and 1980s, most of which was paid for by their home insurance. And Klebold began the lonely task of plowing through years of self-blame. I remember being certain that the birthday cake I had given Dylan on his third birthday wasn't as pretty as the one that his brother had had on his third birthday, which made him feel unloved, and therefore this happened. You go back over every conversation, every gift, every moment, and what you feel is self-loathing. I let this happen. It was my role to keep him safe and to keep others safe too. And somehow this happened because of me, because I wasn't able to stop it. The guilt one feels doesn't fit in a room. It's so huge. Has she forgiven herself? I have forgiven myself to some degree. I don't think I will ever completely forgive myself. I still have dreams about Dylan where he's in danger or climbing up on a high ladder and I'm grabbing for him and he falls. I have this feeling that I allowed him to slip through my fingers. Okay, so that was a summary of this interview.